the origins, because there's kind of some crucial moments that really sparked it. Moving on to why, which again was the title of my talk, this notion of having a developmental lens when you're designing programs or thinking about SEL tasks, how that's helpful and how that actually fits in with the current state of the field, because I think social emotional learning is something that's constantly being updated and it's actually getting more traction in the global sphere just because of what's going on with the world. So of course, as good researchers and practitioners, we need to make sure it's rooted in theory. I focus specifically on emotion understanding development. I have background in psychology and linguistics, so I love words and we think about words and the words we have for feelings. So just to frame a little bit how child emotion understanding fits within SEL, moving on to, of course, just the meat and bones of my systematic review, the method, findings, implications for practice, and then just to zoom out again, thinking about if we're looking at emotion-focused content in SEL programs, how can that actually support learning in today's world? And then also to share a little bit with you what I'm interested in research-wise. So, wrap up the presentation. So moving on, simple question. What is social emotional learning and why does it matter for learning in the sense of going to school? Because obviously we might have a traditional sense of academic achievement, which is just subject matter. But of course, social emotional learning gets at the relationships in a school. Right? I think a school is an extremely social environment. Your intelligence is interplaying with whether or not you're able to make friends, if you feel connected with your teacher. And so originally, if you want a more formalized definition of SEL, you could consider it a form of pedagogy that's focused on specifically promoting and developing social emotional skills in students. That, of course, will help their academic success, but also support their positive development and well-being. So, of course, it's a bit of a broader view of what the purpose of a school is. As I say, this kind of a philosophical underpinning of this notion of the whole child in education or a student-centered approach. You might hear more about that in Montessori schools, or this notion that students need agency. So I would say these are specific choices, right? That we are saying this is what our schools are about, this is what education is about. But then also on the flip side, we also have a body of research that's being built from meta-analyses that actually show academic outcomes are related to social emotional outcomes. So it's not, so it's both a choice of kind of what we as a society or communities might want to promote in our students through education, but knowing that also social emotional factors are actually impacting student success. And whether that's motivation, emotion regulation ability, or even how many friendships you have, right? Something like this. So originally we talked about social emotional learning as two separate words. I think if they would say that it was coined in 1994, which was the year of the first CASEL conference. You might have seen CASEL. If anyone does SEL a lot, they have a framework. CASEL originally stood for the Collaborative for the Advancement of Social Emotional Learning, because obviously we had to really formalize this as a notion that it needs to be part of education practice. Today, it's just called the Collaboration for Academic Social Emotional Learning, so they got rid of the advancement, because I think there's the hope that it's pretty accepted that social emotional learning matters and we don't need to defend it as much. There's also these specific guidelines in 1997 that came out, but I just wanted to flag that, of course, anyone who's been an educator has thought about social emotional learning of their students, just naturally, a teacher in a classroom. But in terms of formal research study, I think we really link it back to, in 1968, we have James Comer. He was at the Child Centered Medical Center at Yale. And he developed the Comer School Development Program. So Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. It's part of Connecticut that's actually quite poor. And so the contrast, right, of this institution surrounded by a lot of poverty. So he went into the schools and was trying to understand, well, when we have students who have low socioeconomic backgrounds, how do we also support their academic achievement? And I think he wrote a piece in 1988 reflecting a bit more on his career, but I specifically pulled out this quote where he said, he just began thinking about the contrast between a child's experiences at home and those in school deeply affects the child's psychosocial development, and that this in turn shapes academic achievement. So again, coming back to that whole school approach, I think if we have any sociologists or anyone who's a fan of Bronfenbrenner, just this notion of when we think of a student, just the different environments that they exist in. And when we think about child development, we have influences at so many stages, and that even though it's complex, it might be difficult as researchers, that we have to embrace that fully to truly understand why a student may or may not be progressing, and also understanding the, how to say, the assessment metrics we're using and whether or not those are appropriate given given the context. And then just again, a slight history just showing that, so in 1968, we kind of have this formal Commerce School development program that gets taken up. Again, these were researchers at Yale from 1987 to 1992. Again, New Haven comes up because that's in Connecticut. And then actually, Roger P. Weisberg, he was the CEO of Castle. So, there was a lot of crossover. And then I would say a lot of the work on social emotional learning then moves to U Chicago from Yale, because Weisberg moves to U Chicago. So again, it's starting, and then we have 1992, right? Again, same name, and Elias, right? Similar names coming up. It is starting in the United States, but of course, social emotional learning is not just a focus in the US, but just to say it's kind of the impetus of formalizing it. And Castle has really grown, I think, in shaping what social emotional looks like. Social emotional learning looks like. It's it's I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Obviously, it's good that you have a formalized body that has been advancing. They do a lot of research. Obviously, they've been around for a while, but then of course we have to reflect on, are we presenting too much of a narrow mindset of what social emotional learning is? Because of course, maybe not of course, but hopefully you will see throughout my talk that the way that we develop emotion understanding and social skills is actually very much informed by context and culture. And we have to think of that. So this long paragraph, I just wanted to provide you with Castle's updated definition of social emotional learning, because they did it in October 2020. It was actually a YouTube video, and it's interesting, of course, that would have been the year when the COVID-19 pandemic was still in full swing. I've underlined the things that they added in essence, and as we read it a little bit, there's a lot that gets covered in social emotional learning. I'm not saying that it doesn't relate, but I just want to keep you thinking about, we are still making choices about how we define what good social emotional skills are in our children, and just to have a bit of that reflection. So they added in that SEL is an integral part of education and human development, all young people, so obviously getting at notion of inclusion or inclusivity, developing healthy identities, which again, the word healthy be problematic, but managing emotions is still there, achieving personal and collective goals, so situating yourself as an individual in society versus among others. They added in the word caring decisions, so I thought that was interesting, that they're kind of making it affective. It's not just pure analytical thinking. And then the second paragraph is more about school family partnerships. But again, SEL advances educational equity and excellence. I think there's a lot put on SEL, and in many ways it's Castle's mission statement. So obviously, as a researcher, for you, when you're trying to understand what social emotional learning looks in practice, this is a big thing to kind of say, okay, well, what does that mean for a teacher in a classroom with children in different backgrounds? So in terms of bringing our discussion to what social emotional learning is looking like in today's world, I would say, as I mentioned previously, it is being considered as a core element to education. I put post-COVID-19 in the sense of, we are still dealing with the after effects, whether it's just learning gains, let alone, the disease is still around, but also social emotional learning has been taken up in a bigger sense of, the climate events are increasing. There's instances of displacement. What can, obviously we need to figure out how can learning not be disrupted through all of that, but then also how can social emotional learning maybe be a buffer or supporting and aligning, because again, teachers will naturally do this right in the classroom, but how can we better also care for the teacher's social emotional well-being as well as the students. And then there is, if any of you are interested more in the kind of international development lens, there's a piece by Brush et al. that links it up link social emotional learning up with the current sustainable development goals that were set out by the United Nations. And I just wanted to mention that in even in 2023, the OECD is the Office for Economic Cooperation and Development. They did a big survey on social emotional skills that has 2 volumes. Now, OECD, they do the PISA assessment, which you might be familiar with. So normally they're a bit more, although they call them children, we're talking 15-year-olds most of the time. So again, it's child development, so you have to get used to that sometimes in the world of international development, what gets counted as a child. But this survey specifically of the SEL skills was with students aged 10 and 15. And then I just also wanted to mention that UNESCO, I mean, they previously had made calls to make social emotional, they developed frameworks for schools to think about SEL, but they recently released, February 2024, this piece, Strengthening Social and Emotional Learning in Hybrid Modes of Education, Building Support for Students, Teachers, Schools, and Families. So just saying that it's very much a topic people are concerned with right now. So moving on to, if there's going to be a big global uptake, right, or hopefully governments thinking more, policy makers thinking more actively about how can social emotional learning be a part of the classroom, the question of what's going to be that program, what's going to be in that program, how is it designed, and I wanted to re-emphasize with my systematic review basically the need for keeping a developmental lens, especially when we develop programs, because again, there might be a need in education, people band together. But again, if it's not, these are topics that are rooted in how child development research has accumulated throughout time. There are certain realities to how a brain develops, how children exist. And I think in many ways, these programs could become biased, right, to whoever wants to do it, because that's how they think about feelings and that's how they think about social skills. So trying to align these 2 worlds a bit more. And actually, Denham is a name you will see a lot actually in SEL, but Carol Denham, she wrote a paper of why we need to keep social emotional learning developmental, specifically, again, it's just to develop age appropriate tasks, content, and standards as meant just as researcher fields. The way that we can keep social emotional learning developmental is by, well, in essence, just stresses the importance of a theory of change. I think you've been probably looking at interventions and how do you design interventions to promote a change in student outcomes. So in essence, this notion of, you might hear a lot of people say we want something research informed or evidence informed, but what does that really mean? It means that, of course, that there's some alignment with a previously established theoretical model that has been tested with real individuals and verified. It's not just about references of what we want to teach. And also just the benefits of having a development, like a child development lens to SEL. I just think that, we can be more true to this goal of being evidence-based and how we make decisions, what content, and how we choose to inform practice. Of course, developmentally appropriate, and then also, I think as researchers, we would also be interested in just explaining program impact, right? Because of course, if we have any evidence that a SEL program, has positive impact on children, that's great. But why, how, for who, and getting to this very specific causal explanation cannot happen if we don't have a sense of what the theory of the program was, let alone if we question the measures that were used, right? It's hard to kind of tease that out. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention Dussault and Thompson actually put together, again, 2024 framework of trying to think of what are these fundamental themes of social emotional learning, because again, social emotional learning SEL is a big umbrella and then it covers a lot. But they did try to unify all the research that's been done in this area, whether it's from child development, education, mental health. And the main themes that came out for what social emotional learning tends to focus on is self-regulation, critical thinking, self-motivation, compassion, collaboration. So again, just to say that there is the benefit also of having research that takes a bit of a step back, like a systematic review, and looks at trends so that we can all, in a sense, just get on the same page as researchers, just to put it simply. And so, big question of the day for me in my review was, how can social emotional learning in schools promote child emotional understanding specifically, right? So very quickly, I'm still okay, sorry. Just to give a quick definition of what I mean by emotional understanding. It often gets abbreviated as EU, so that's why that's up there. So very broadly, emotional understanding is the ability to identify, interpret, and communicate about emotions, whether that's in the experience by the individual or the people. And yeah, just that second point, this notion of a conceptual knowledge of emotions. So of course you have words for emotions, but you also have kind of a perhaps nonverbal understanding of what an emotional experience is. And so that's kind of getting at the conceptual understanding aspect of it. And within that inventory, so to speak, you have an understanding of what might potentially cause said emotion that you have in your mind. Maybe certain environments might lead to that. Within that inventory for that specific emotion, you might have a sense of the physiological reactions, right? Like whether you feel a bit hot when you're nervous or angry, or even as psychologists will always test how much someone's sweating, really, and it's notions of anxiety, but also physical displays, and by that we mean facial expressions for the most part. So that is kind of all encompassed in your emotional understanding. It is different from emotional competence, but very interlinked. I just wanted to bring that up because it is a term that comes up a lot. Again, Sarni is a big name. This was in 1999, was defining what emotional competence is and whittled it down to 8 skills. So again, still awareness of emotions of others, still a main theme. There's some self-regulation in the sense of capacity for adaptive coping with aversive emotions. So obviously just a fancy way of saying negative feelings, can you self-regulate to kind of mitigate that negative state? And I think what's interesting with the skills here is that it builds right to awareness of the role of emotions in relationships, and then the capacity for self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is linked a lot to emotional competence, this notion of your ability to achieve or complete tasks is actually being related to your ability to regulate your emotions, which is of course useful for educators or just as a student. There is something called academic emotions, even, when you get test anxiety, but even knowing how to manage your emotions with others in a classroom, there's kind of a big developmental learning curve, I think, that happens. Just to say that emotional understanding in education is often linked to emotion recognition. So again, just the ability to identify emotions in yourself or others, to name them, as well as emotion regulation. So again, getting back to your knowledge of strategies or your ability to have an emotional experience, but then maybe to mitigate it if needed, so that you can coexist with others. And then there's also longitudinal evidence supporting the relationship between these two emotion factors and later academic achievement, which is interesting. So emotion competence and understanding in childhood relating to later academic achievement, and then also even adult depression levels. I think I just wanted, if you do focus on early childhood education, I think school readiness is a concept that will come up a lot. So just whether or not child is ready to be in a classroom, because again, it is a big transition, right? When you go from caregiver focus thing. And again, emotions still play a big part. And emotion socialization, again, just another concept word, means the practices that we're all raised with our caregivers, and also maybe the adults, our schools, even our peers are giving us cues as to how we're allowed to express emotions and how we're and so whether it's facial expressions, or maybe that, if you feel angry, it's okay to shout, or maybe no, if you feel angry, you need to keep it to yourself. So that's just understanding again that emotions are not happening in isolation. They're always in some contextualized in some social scheme. The Pond's developmental model of emotional understanding is the main model, I'd say, in terms of, or more comprehensive model of trying to describe how a child develops emotional understanding from age 3 to 11. He set it up, with his team, set it up into 3 levels: external, mental, reflective, and then there's 9 components, so 3 components for each level. It's very, very clean, but it was empirically verified, and obviously just pulling on the literature to set up these different phases. And there's also the test of emotion comprehension that was used based off of this, that tests child emotion understanding ability. I'm not going to go too much into this just yet, but just know that this framework was useful for my systematic review when we get into later. So bring us to my review in itself. I had two main research questions. The first was just very simple. Which components of child emotion understanding have been targeted by school-based SEL programs for grades 3 to 5, so that's years 4 to 6. I'm looking at children in middle childhood, ages 8 to 11. And does the emotion-focused content of SEL programs, right, so the lessons that are supposed to teach children about emotions, is aligning with the theoretical models of EU development that we have for children, let's say whether it's PONS. And I also used the social information processing model by Crick and Dodge, but we'll get into that later. The aims really of the review were quite simple in the sense of, because we didn't have this as the precedent, so to speak, it's just, just to analyze the content of SEL programs, because that you don't often you really rarely come across it, honestly, in systematic reviews and meta-analyses, in the sense of like looking at lesson plans and thinking, well, what are the trends in how we're teaching certain X topic to students? And then again, so just determining whether or not that links up with child development models and the way that they're choosing to teach emotions in these school programs. And then again, I hope that the review would be able to just add to the evidence base for a specific, to answer the question of, okay, well, how is emotion being taught in a specific age band, middle childhood, and within SEL, not focusing on all of the social skills and all the skills of social emotional learning, but just really digging a bit deeper into the emotional learning bit. So I would try to do a big review, went 17 databases, looked at studies from 2009 to December 2020, can talk a bit about why 2009. I don't know if anyone's going to do systematic review, but very happy to talk a bit more about method at the end of this if you have any questions. Looked for quantitative outcome studies. So again, really studies that were assessing whether or not a social emotional learning program was done in a school, and they were measuring, did it have an impact on social emotional skills? Very simple. So whether that's randomized control trials, quasi experiments, pre-test, post-test design, try to keep it fairly open. At the time that I was doing my search, of course, you always have to look at existing reviews because you don't want to duplicate efforts. These are kind of the main names. Durlek et al., I would say, is also a meta-analysis, and that's really the kind of the first research evidence synthesis that we have on SEL. So that's always a good starting point. But overall, these reviews focused on a wide age range, so you couldn't really answer a specific question. Well, okay, it's great that it's having an impact, but what about just for middle childhood, or just for high school students, or just for early childhood? It's hard to parse out their findings and tag specific developmental phases. Emotional understanding, again, my outcome variable of interest was not isolated, right? They would just say SEL skills in general. So that's what I mean by composite scores, because measures of SEL are often, you can't really tell if it's emotion regulation being tested. It's just not parsed out. So I can't answer the question as to how emotion understanding is being promoted. And then lastly, these reviews tend to focus more actually on whether or not the SEL program has an impact on academic performance, rather than promoting the social emotional learning skill, if that makes sense. So they're just, that's really what their outcome measure is. It's like, okay, this child participated in the program. Did it improve their academic grades? Perhaps just because I'm a psychologist, I was just curious of like, okay, but did it also shape, their ability to understand emotions? Of course, great that there is an effect on academic achievement, but just to have more details, right, on what these programs are really doing to child development. These were my inclusion exclusion criteria for the systematic review. Main thing to always specify is that, I don't know where it is. Well, just to say that these were all studies that had a program that was given during the school day to all children. So not a pull-out method, not targeting students with specific behavioral issues. Just wanted to see very broadly, when we do a universal social emotional learner program, what are these programs really focusing on to teach emotions? If you're doing a review, so PRISMA stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. They will ask you to provide the diagram that pretty much shows your decisions and your process for identifying studies, from searching those databases online to the screening process, which would be based on the criteria that I showed you to see whether or not this is relevant. And then we get to an eligibility phase, which is where I also did a quality rating of studies. And at this point, normally all of this is happening at the level of title and abstracts. Yeah, this is not touchscreen for title and abstracts. And then as you get forward to seeing, is this truly going to be a good fit for my review? That's when you actually read the full text. And then of course, just you add all your reasons for why you excluded. And so in the end, after all of my criteria were met and I screened them with another independent reviewer and quality rated the studies, we were left with 54 studies that were included in the review. And within those 54 studies, there was 38 different social emotional learning programs. So again, as I said, I was really focused on the content. So of those 38 programs, we extracted the name of the program, of course, and then any lesson names, the aims and topics of each lesson, and then when it was reported which activity was done. And I just wanted to note that all the studies that were included in the review were before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So of course, things are different now. Or just in terms of also trying to assess, the kind of emotional impact and whether or not that's a confounding variable maybe on these studies. But yeah, everything was just before February 2020. I thought, obviously we'd ideally love an equal spread across continents in terms of where the research was coming from, but it was nice to see that we could at least get from studies, from a broad range of places. Of course, with the limitation that the research ultimately needed to either be published in English or in a language that you or one of the reviewers can read, right? So that just to be aware of, there could be more studies, but that is a limitation we deal with. Just to say that the reason why there's a smaller number of programs than there are studies is because some studies use the same program, just in case that was a question. But it wasn't a wash in terms of across the board, everyone else just used Friends or Paths. It really, we only have two or three right at smallest. But yeah, 24 studies used a program. So 44% of the studies in my review roughly used a program that maybe another study used. I've listed out just kind of the countries if of interest for those studies and the names of the programs. Paths was the most common in the sense of those 8 studies, and it seems that it would only have been translated, so at least for the Netherlands, would have been translated once, but everyone else may be using variants of English. But in those other cases, if the base language was in English, they translated it. But I wouldn't say these programs were all developed in English-speaking countries first. And then the rest of the studies, they either used pre-existing, so the majority used just pre-existing social emotional learning programs, and they just had a different choice of which skills they wanted to focus on. And then 5 were actually developed by the research study teams who published the study. So, and they were based in Australia, Portugal, Scotland, Turkey, and South Korea. So again, seeing a range. Which is just interesting, I think, as a researcher to see how researchers around the world are thinking about emotions, even when they're coming from very, very different places. So the main unit of analysis, sorry, it's a repeat for systematic review experts, but just the same, what you're really doing after you've included all of these studies to answer your research questions, the bulk of the findings is about synthesizing really what you can say about trends in the different studies you've collected. So we might call that a narrative synthesis. So what I did is I mapped these social emotional learning programs to the child development frameworks, right? So it's a conceptual mapping exercise. I extracted, like I said, the SEL program name, the lesson aims and activities when they reported them, and then I mapped each of those activities with another reviewer to this framework of based on child emotion understanding development. So there was the Pons model that I showed you earlier, and then Crick and Dodge, their 94 social information processing model, which created a framework of 10 different components that encapsulates the different skills tied to emotional understanding. So we have recognition, external cause, reminder, belief, desire. Belief and desire is just this understanding that individuals have different, can have different emotions based on the different beliefs they have, so the different desires they have. Reminder is just using, talking about the role of memory and emotion, that of course you can have an emotional experience. That's something in the present brings back an emotional experience from the past, even if it's a different intensity. I would say from recognition to morality, those are the 9 that you already find in the Pons model, and it's really just the last one, decision action, that I was pulling from the Crick and Dodge social information processing model, because of course we're also looking at social emotional learning, the interplay of emotions and social interaction. This is a little bit overwhelming, I do apologize, but it's the Crick and Dodge. It also goes by the SIP model. There's 6 phases, and it's just really here of they're trying to explain what happens when two people interact, in essence. And it's really at the level of, it's all about cues, right? And you get cues and then you make a decision. It makes us all sound like computers, I must admit, but it's really at the level of response, access, or construction. So when you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I, this is the information I have, how do I act? And then when you make a decision of how to act, this is where the emotion, thinking about your emotions about the situation, maybe the emotional impact on the other person, that's when it's. So in terms of findings, so as I said, we map the programs as a whole at that simple level of, does this program have a lesson that touches on the concept of recognition or the component of external cause? And this is just a frequency count, so that's showing how many programs are addressing a certain emotional understanding component, and then I just kept the Pons distinction if it's of interest. Well, we can get into that later. So the most common emotional understanding components that were targeted were recognition, emotion regulation, and then this new decision action topic I was getting at. Obviously, not too surprisingly, because it is social emotional learning programs, but again, it's just good to do good, due diligence as to what are we really focusing on in the classroom. Just to say that 38 programs did recognition, so that means all of them, of course, did emotion recognition, which is nice as let's just say a basis. Followed by that, still pretty. Something that external events can cause emotions within you. You have a reaction to them, and your ability to make that link of like, oh, it was because of this that I thought this and then felt this, just creating that pathway in the child's mind. And then again, desire and belief, which if any of you work on theory of mind, that a child's ability to represent somebody else's mind and their desires and beliefs is kind of a key milestone. False belief understanding might come up from a lot of new studies, and then of course language actually gets really involved. But again, still important here. For emotions, somewhere kind of in the middle was morality, right? We have 12 out of 38 programs that are focusing on morality. Social emotional learning isn't necessarily character development. It's not necessarily focused on morality. But this is more, in Pons's definition, it's the understanding that morally laudable or good actions will result in positive emotional states, and morally reprehensible or I guess that is the word. It just sounds so grand, morally reprehensible, but that something morally reprehensible would result in negative emotional states. So obviously the school programs are not focusing too much, but it was still there. And then the least targeted components were reminder. So again, that just knowing that there's a relationship between memory and emotional experience. Hiding, which is it's kind of an interesting one, is just knowing it's that moment when you learn that someone's internal state might not match their outward expression, right? And again, whether or not you need to teach that officially in the classroom or we just naturally learn it. Different story, as you can see, just one program focused on that. And mixed gets at the understanding that so children actually have to learn that you need to how to say, you're able to have mixed emotional states. You can have positive feelings and negative feelings, or you can do a bit in the middle that is an actual kind of developmental milestone. So in terms of the way that I've set up my findings, I basically have my main findings on the left and then just kind of a takeaway as I see it, just to set up for us. So again, it seems humble, but it was reassuring that at least one program targeted a component in the child's emotional understanding development models, because these are programs that didn't say, hi, I'm using PONS or I'm using X psychological theory, right? There's just programs with lessons, aims, and topics. So it's just nice that they weren't completely misaligned. Because of course we would just have a lot more work to do across fields otherwise. At least half of the social emotional learning programs in included studies even targeted 60% of the components. So again, it's not a huge kind of sweep, but there is some consistency, right, and overlap in terms of what we think are would be appropriate for children ages 8 to 11. To teach them. And then lastly, just getting back at the activities, because of course, when you're trying to answer the how question, right? Let's say if we know that, okay, this lesson specifically on emotion recognition was impacting emotional understanding development, it's good for us to know then, right? Well, what was the teacher doing at the time? And unfortunately, in the studies themselves, and of course word count is an issue, and maybe we don't have that information, you wouldn't get the breakdown by lesson of what activities. It's more a broad description. So at least you have some sense of what they're doing. And as you can see, there's a lot across programs. They use board games, discussion, a lot of dramatization, right? Skits. They also did guided visualizations, which was maybe more when mindfulness was kind of being wrapped up into emotion regulation, drawing, we had meditation, audio recordings. There was, still reading to children, writing activities. They also used music. Again, a lot in the classroom, but unfortunately couldn't give that clear breakdown of, in the sense of my findings can't speak to whether or not, emotion recognition tends to use, audio recordings, whereas external cause is always when you read a scenario to a child. I can't speak to that yet, but and that's also because a lot of social emotional learning programs are held behind payment walls. So it's really hard actually to access a lot of this content if you're not saying you're using it yourself. So the main takeaway again, just that there's really, a decent level of overlap, I'd say, between the developmental models of child emotion understanding that we've talked about and the programs that were in these studies, even though the studies really, I think, varied in their choice of SEL program, as well as which have their own theories of change established, let alone study setting and sample. I think that it's interesting that there's a certain convergence, right, to specific topics in emotional understanding. As I mentioned earlier, everything focused on emotion recognition, and then zooming out to look at maybe the top three, which were emotion recognition, emotion regulation, both of emotions when you're making decisions in social situations. Those three were kind of consistently what programs we're targeting. And I just wanted to say a bit more descriptively that these three were often the lessons talked about these topics in a way that they wanted to encourage children to be able to identify and regulate their emotions so that they wouldn't have negative social interactions either with peers or adults, or that they wouldn't be disrupting learning in the classroom. So it wasn't just for their own well-being. Just to say that it's, I think, not surprising that these, were the main focus of social emotional learning programs. But again, reassuring that, there's that these are relevant developmentally and also very useful because they are foundational to a child's ability to understand emotions and to relate to each other, and then also to self-regulate. So, yeah. And then just saying in terms of, I don't think it is problematic that maybe certain programs focus on a certain EU component versus another, because it could be also just reflecting what you have to teach in the classroom or what's necessary. But it also brings in the question of, well, why are we choosing to use a social emotional learning program in a classroom to begin with? I think on this slide, because I know I'm pretty much at time. Nothing. Well, yeah. So ultimately, I think it's really just the last point, because scenarios are used a lot as phrasal expressions. Just the importance of context is being used to teach children about emotions and how to think about emotions. So this notion that it's the lived experience, and then of course, if it is going to be about, if that's really important to teaching emotion understanding to children in SEL programs, what is that lived experience of the child? And I think that aligns with current thinking in today's social emotional learning field, where there's many calls for the programs to be culture grounded, inclusive, transformative in the service of education equity, and also more person centered. Again, this is being backed up. I think there was a study by McCoy et al. I think it was across 43 different countries that there was a context specific acquisition timing for certain social emotional skills. So depending on which country those children were, let's just, everyone will be acquiring emotion recognition, but that scale and that timeline is varying across the sites. And then again, just zooming out a little bit, that, the global events and the pandemic, there is an emotional impact on children, that, like all humans, let alone the parents, the caregivers, and the teachers, let alone of climate change and conflict. And so I just wanted to, these references are reflecting on that, just the need to take SEL programs will need to take those into account going forward. And the idea that teachers are a source of emotional support, but perhaps with research we have to consider their own emotional regulation and also their burnout and how that's impacting the classroom environment. I have my future research. Should I pause or 5 minutes? 5 minutes, okay, great. Conclusions and next steps, almost there. So I just simply put, this review sets the precedent in essence for just analyzing the content of SEL programs. Obviously, I did specifically middle childhood, focused on emotional understanding, but you could do this for any developmental phase you're interested in or any topic. And then also just setting precedent of how do we bring in the child development theory into this work. That is sometimes more maybe practitioner focused and not always the realm of psychology. I am finishing up a paper. Well, I did, so of those studies with the systematic review, I did do a meta-analysis as well. So just hoping to need to update some of it, but hopefully that will be published soon. And again, spoiler alert, it does have an impact participating on emotion understanding development. So that was a nice win that all this work is actually making a difference. And I thought that just when we do systematic reviews, it would be good, because these were mostly intervention studies, like I said, outcome studies. And I think because I've been working more in the international development space, just learning how, a lot of programs are being done in countries that are just get written up maybe like as evaluation reports. UNICEF has them, UNESCO has them, maybe other governments have them, but that's not coming into our research literature. Yet these are real SEL programs that are being done in those contexts, and that maybe could help address the mismatch of which countries are producing which research and why we only know about emotions in classrooms, in certain classrooms of certain countries, if we kind of open up the scope. It's just a question of getting the database access to it. And then the second big point is just emotion-focused social emotional learning content needs to be flexible enough ultimately so that we can localize it to the children that it's going to be delivered to. And then to think also about the larger community, the larger emotional socialization practices that are happening, because of course that's going to influence how a child engages with the program to begin with. And I think that, this flexibility in program design, we can only really do that if we have more evidence on the nature and how and development of emotion concepts across cultures, how it might differ, right? So more research for that. And just to say that I'm also developing a different paper on internal state language more broadly. So like I said, I have a background in linguistics. So this was looking at the relationship between the way that children talk about emotions and define emotions and how that relates to their use of mental state term language. So think, believe, forget, remember. So I just call that's internal state language more broadly. Because of course that matters to social cognition. So this is the actual paper. If you want to read it, it's still in pre-press, but it is available at that link. As you can see, it's a Journal of Social and Emotional Learning, Research Practice Policy. I just put it there because it is new. I think 2 years now, maybe it's been live. It's a recent thing, maybe 3 years, but as you can see, Castle is there again. So it was funded and put forward by Castle, but again, just because they are the biggest voice in the room doesn't mean that they should be the only voice. So just continue your research. So thank you very much.